At 9:30 a.m. on October 5, 1963, President John F. Kennedy sat in the cabinet room listening to Defense Secretary Robert McNamara argue for something unprecedented, a complete withdrawal from Vietnam. "We need a way to get out of Vietnam," McNamara told the president, "and this is a way of doing it." Kennedy agreed. 6 days later, on October 11, 1963, he signed National Security Action Memorandum 263. NSM 263. The directive was simple: withdraw 1,000 troops by the end of 1963, complete the withdrawal of nearly all remaining forces by the end of 1965. Get America out of Vietnam. The plan was kept secret, no formal announcement, no public debate. Kennedy would implement it quietly, claiming the withdrawals were routine rotations. After his re-election in 1964, he would finish the job. 42 days later, Kennedy was dead. 5 days after his funeral, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed NSM 273. The new directive referenced Kennedy's October withdrawal statement, but the substance had changed. The course had reversed, and within 2 years, 500,000 American soldiers would be fighting in Vietnam. If you want to understand one of history's greatest what-if questions, would there have been a Vietnam War if Kennedy had lived? Please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this, and please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to October 1963. The story begins not in October, but in May 1963. On May 6, 1963, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara convened the 8th Secretary of Defense Conference in Honolulu. The agenda included something remarkable: a comprehensive plan for Vietnam that featured a plan to withdraw 1,000 U.S. personnel from RVN, Republic of Vietnam, by December 1963. McNamara was explicit. He wanted withdrawal plans developed. He wanted training plans created for the Vietnamese to permit a more rapid phase-out of remaining U.S. forces. This wasn't speculation. It wasn't contingency planning. McNamara was ordering his staff to prepare for withdrawal. Why? Because by spring 1963, Kennedy had reached a conclusion about Vietnam. As he told his friend Charles Bartlett, "We don't have a prayer of staying in Vietnam. Those people hate us. They're going to throw our asses out of there at any point." Kennedy's skepticism about Vietnam wasn't new. In 1962, he'd told Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield, "I can't do it until 1965, after I'm re-elected." Mansfield had urged withdrawal. Kennedy agreed, but said the political cost would be too high before the election. By mid-1963, Kennedy's concerns had deepened. The government of South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem was collapsing. Buddhist monks were setting themselves on fire in protest. Diem's secret police were conducting brutal crackdowns, and the war against communist insurgents wasn't going well despite optimistic reports from military advisors. Kennedy faced a political dilemma. The conservative right wing would savage him if he withdrew from Vietnam. They would claim he was soft on communism, that he was abandoning an ally, that he was surrendering Southeast Asia to the Soviets. Kennedy couldn't afford that criticism before the 1964 election. But after re-election, then he would have the political capital to withdraw. So Kennedy developed a two-part strategy. First, claim the war was going well. Present withdrawals is a sign of success, not failure. Tell the American people that South Vietnamese forces were becoming capable of defending themselves so American advisors could come home. Second, keep the plan secret. No public announcements, no debate in Congress. Implement withdrawals as routine rotations. After the election, complete the pullout and present it as victory. It was politically brilliant and morally questionable. Kennedy would campaign in 1964, claiming progress in Vietnam while secretly planning to abandon the mission immediately afterward. But it might have worked, and it might have prevented the Vietnam War. In September 1963, Kennedy sent McNamara and General Maxwell Taylor, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to Vietnam. Their mission: assess the situation and develop the withdrawal plan. McNamara and Taylor arrived in Saigon on September 23, 1963. For 9 days, they toured military installations, met with American advisors, and received briefings from South Vietnamese commanders. On October 2, 1963, they returned to Washington and met with Kennedy at the White House. We know exactly what was said because Kennedy had secretly installed a recording system. The tape was declassified in 1997. McNamara's voice is unmistakable on the recording. He tells Kennedy, "We need a way to get out of Vietnam, and this is a way of doing it." McNamara presents the plan. 1,000 troops withdrawn by the end of 1963. The major part of the U.S. military task can be completed by the end of 1965. Nearly all American forces, more than 16,000 personnel, home within 2 years. Kennedy listens. Then he makes a critical decision. The withdrawal of 1,000 troops should proceed. But it should not be raised formally. Instead, it should be carried out routinely as part of our general posture of withdrawing people when they are no longer needed. In other words, do it quietly, don't announce it, don't make it a big deal, let it happen without attracting attention. Why the secrecy? Kennedy explains on the tape. Political considerations. He doesn't want South Vietnamese President Diem to interpret the withdrawal as American abandonment or pressure. He doesn't want domestic conservatives to attack him for cutting and running, and Kennedy hasn't decided whether he can sell the withdrawal as success. If South Vietnam collapses, he may have to acknowledge failure and withdraw anyway. But if the situation stabilizes, he can present withdrawal as victory. On October 11, 1963, Kennedy signs NSAM 263. The memorandum is brief and precise. The President approved the military recommendations contained in Section 1B.1.3 of the report, but directed that no formal announcement be made of the implementation of plans to withdraw 1,000 U.S. military personnel by the end of 1963. This was official U.S. policy, not a suggestion, not a possibility. Official policy, signed by the President, withdraw 1,000 troops by December 31, 1963. Complete withdrawal by December 31, 1965. Get out of Vietnam. But there was a problem, a catastrophic problem that would arrive 3 weeks later. November 1, 1963. Saigon, South Vietnam. South Vietnamese military officers launched a coup against President Ngo Dinh Diem. U.S. Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge had been aware of the coup plans. Kennedy had authorized contacts with the coup plotters, but insisted on a bloodless ouster. Diem would be removed but not killed. The coup succeeded. Diem and his brother were captured. Then, on November 2nd, they were executed in the back of an armored personnel carrier. Kennedy was shocked. He had not authorized assassination. According to witnesses, when Kennedy heard the news, he rushed from the room with a look of shock and dismay on his face which I had never seen before. The coup created chaos. The new military junta led by General Duong Van Minh was weak and divided. Factional infighting paralyzed the government. The war against the Viet Cong stalled. Rural pacification efforts collapsed. Kennedy's withdrawal plan had been predicated on stability, not necessarily victory, but at least a functional South Vietnamese government capable of defending itself after American forces left. Now that stability was gone. For 3 weeks, Kennedy's administration grappled with the chaos. The withdrawal plan remained official policy. No documents show Kennedy suspending or revising NSAM 263, but military planners were reassessing. Could the withdrawal proceed if South Vietnam was collapsing? Kennedy gave hints of his thinking in public statements. On November 14, 1963, he reaffirmed that the long-range objective was to remove U.S. forces once South Vietnam could defend itself. He was still committed to withdrawal, but the timeline might need adjustment. The routine nature of the pullout might need to be reconsidered. Kennedy would address these questions after returning from his trip to Texas. He was scheduled to visit Dallas, San Antonio, Houston, Fort Worth, and Austin. Political fence mending. Preparing for 1964 re-election, he would deal with Vietnam when he got back. November 22, 1963, Dallas, Texas, 12:30 p.m., 3 shots, Dealey Plaza. President Kennedy was dead, and with him died the plan to withdraw from Vietnam. November 22, 1963. 2:38 p.m., Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as president aboard Air Force One. Johnson's first priority was projecting continuity. America was in shock. The world was watching. Johnson needed to reassure allies, calm the public, and demonstrate he was in control. On November 24th, Johnson met with national security officials. According to the New York Times, he reaffirmed that the October 2nd statement on the 1,000-man troop withdrawal remains in force. Johnson was telling the truth, technically. The withdrawal of 1,000 troops did proceed. By December 1963, approximately 683 advisors had departed Vietnam. But context matters. Those troops left as part of normal turnover cycle, routine rotations, not a policy shift. And additional deployments to Vietnam had been approved during the fall. So the absolute number of advisory troops in Vietnam never decreased. As the Pentagon Papers later explained, the 1,000-man withdrawal became an accounting exercise. Troops rotated in and out as they always had. The withdrawal was cosmetic, not substantive. Johnson knew this. On November 26, 1963, one day after Kennedy's funeral, he signed NSAM 273. On the surface, NSAM 273 maintained continuity with Kennedy's policy. It referenced the October 2nd White House statement about withdrawal. It affirmed U.S. commitment to helping South Vietnam defeat the communist insurgency. But the substance had changed. NSAM 273 strengthened provisions about planning action against North Vietnam, implying that the U.S. would assist and participate in covert action in North Vietnam at the behest of the U.S. military. Read that carefully. Kennedy's policy had been withdrawal. Johnson's policy was covert action against North Vietnam, escalation, not de-escalation. NSAM 273 also emphasized that withdrawal objectives remain as stated in the October statement. But crucially, those objectives were now conditioned on progress in the war. If the war went badly, withdrawals would stop. Under Kennedy, withdrawal was policy regardless of battlefield conditions. Kennedy had told McNamara, "We need a way to get out of Vietnam, and this is a way of doing it." Success or failure, Kennedy wanted out. Under Johnson, withdrawal was conditional on victory, and victory was nowhere in sight. Johnson's private comments revealed his true thinking. He told advisors he could not see that this was a constructive move in view of the decision to intensify the effort. Translation: Kennedy's withdrawal plan made no sense if America was going to escalate the war, and Johnson intended to escalate. Why? Several reasons. First, Johnson was a Cold War hawk. He believed in the domino theory. If South Vietnam fell to communism, all of Southeast Asia would follow. Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, eventually Indonesia. Hundreds of millions of people under communist control. Second, Johnson feared being labeled soft on communism. He remembered how Republicans destroyed Harry Truman politically after China fell to the communists in 1949. Johnson wasn't going to lose Vietnam and give conservatives that weapon. Third, Johnson's advisors, McNamara, National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, all recommended staying the course. Kennedy had been skeptical of his advisors. Johnson trusted them. Fourth, Johnson didn't have Kennedy's foreign policy credibility. Kennedy had faced down Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He had negotiated the nuclear test ban treaty. He could afford to withdraw from Vietnam and not look weak. Johnson had no such credentials. He was a domestic policy expert, civil rights, Medicare, the war on poverty. Foreign policy wasn't his strength. He couldn't risk appearing weak on communism. So Johnson reversed course, quietly, without announcing it, while claiming continuity with Kennedy's policy. By 1965, Johnson had committed hundreds of thousands of combat troops to Vietnam. By 1968, more than 500,000 American soldiers were fighting in Southeast Asia. By 1973, when the last Americans left, 58,000 Americans had died. Millions of Vietnamese, North and South, were dead. The war Kennedy had planned to end became Johnson's war, America's war, the defining tragedy of a generation. For decades, historians have debated a single question. Would Kennedy have withdrawn from Vietnam if he had lived? The debate is fierce, passionate, and ultimately unknowable because Kennedy didn't live. But the evidence is overwhelming that Kennedy intended to withdraw. The question isn't whether he planned withdrawal. The question is whether he would have followed through. The evidence for withdrawal. 1. May 1963. Honolulu Conference, McNamara ordered development of withdrawal plans. This wasn't idle speculation. It was a directive to military planners. 2. October 2nd, 1963. White House meeting. Audio tape proves McNamara told Kennedy, "We need a way to get out of Vietnam, and this is a way of doing it." Kennedy approved. 3. October 11th, 1963, NSAM 263. Official policy, signed by the President, 1,000 troops out by December, bulk of forces out by end of 1965. 4. Implementation, the withdrawal began. 683 troops left by December 1963, exactly as Kennedy had ordered. 5. Kennedy's private comments. Multiple witnesses report Kennedy told friends he wanted out of Vietnam but couldn't do it politically before re-election. 6. Pattern of behavior. Kennedy had rejected military pressure to invade Cuba, to use nuclear weapons, to escalate conflicts. He consistently chose de-escalation when advisors urged escalation. As economist James Galbraith, who has studied the documents extensively, concluded, President Kennedy had approved that plan. It was the actual policy of the United States on the day Kennedy died. Even Francis Bader, who served as Lyndon Johnson's deputy national security advisor, acknowledged, Professor Galbraith is correct that there was a plan to withdraw U.S. forces from Vietnam, beginning with the first 1,000 by December 1963, and almost all of the rest by the end of 1965. President Kennedy had approved that plan. The arguments against withdrawal. 1. Conditional on success. Some historians argue Kennedy's withdrawal was contingent on South Vietnamese victory. If the war went badly, Kennedy would have stayed. 2. Public statements. Kennedy publicly affirmed U.S. commitment to South Vietnam. In September 1963, he told Walter Cronkite, "In the final analysis, it is their war," but he also said the U.S. shouldn't withdraw. 3. Political pressure. Republicans and conservative Democrats would have savaged Kennedy for losing Vietnam. Could Kennedy have withstood that pressure? 4. Post-assassination memoirs. Kennedy advisors who later claimed JFK planned withdrawal published those claims after Vietnam became a disaster. Earlier memoirs made no such claims. 5. Historian skepticism. Distinguished historians like Frederick Loggeval argue NSAM 263 hardly represented the kind of far-reaching policy initiative that the incipient withdrawal proponents suggest. The truth is probably more complex than either side acknowledges. Kennedy likely intended to withdraw. The documented evidence, the tapes, the memos, the directives, all support that conclusion. But Kennedy was also a politician. He intended to withdraw while claiming success. If South Vietnam collapsed spectacularly before he could complete withdrawal, would Kennedy have stuck to the plan? Or would he have reversed course to avoid political disaster? We'll never know. What we do know is this. Kennedy signed an order to withdraw from Vietnam. 42 days later, Kennedy was dead. 5 days after his funeral, Johnson reversed the policy. 10 years later, 58,000 Americans were dead. The timing is inescapable, the contrast is stark, and the question haunts history. Was Kennedy killed because of his Vietnam policy? Conspiracy theorists have argued for decades that Kennedy's assassination was orchestrated by military-industrial interests who wanted the Vietnam War. The evidence doesn't support that theory. But the evidence does support something more disturbing. Kennedy's withdrawal policy created powerful enemies. The military wanted escalation. The CIA wanted covert operations against North Vietnam. Defense contractors anticipated massive profits from a major war. Cold War hawks believed withdrawal meant communist victory. All of these interests were threatened by Kennedy's withdrawal plan. And all of these interests benefited when Johnson reversed course. Did they conspire to kill Kennedy? No credible evidence suggests that. But did they celebrate Johnson's decision to escalate? Absolutely. General Curtis LeMay, the Air Force chief who had urged Kennedy to invade Cuba during the missile crisis, got the war he wanted. The Pentagon got its testing ground for counterinsurgency doctrine. Defense contractors got billions in contracts. Hawks got to continue fighting communism. And Kennedy's plan to end American involvement in Vietnam died with him. The lesson isn't about conspiracy. The lesson is about institutional inertia, about how bureaucracies resist change, about how powerful interests outlast individual presidents. Kennedy served 1,036 days. The Pentagon, the CIA, the defense contractors, they were there before Kennedy, and they were there after Kennedy. They knew they could wait him out, or pressure him to reverse course, or convince his successor to abandon his plans. And that's exactly what happened. Let's engage in speculation. What if Kennedy had lived? What if he'd won re-election in 1964 and implemented his withdrawal plan? Scenario 1. Successful withdrawal. Kennedy completes troop withdrawals by end of 1965. South Vietnam struggles, but doesn't immediately collapse. Kennedy claims victory. We trained the Vietnamese to defend themselves. Conservatives criticize but can't prove Kennedy wrong for several years. No massive American ground war. 58,000 American lives saved. Millions of Vietnamese lives saved. Scenario 2, South Vietnam collapses. Kennedy withdraws. South Vietnam falls to communism in 1966-67. Republicans crucify Kennedy. He's called the president who lost Vietnam just as Truman lost China. Kennedy's domestic agenda, civil rights, war on poverty, stalls. His presidency is damaged but not destroyed. Still, no American ground war. 58,000 lives saved. Scenario 3, Kennedy reverses course. Political pressure mounts. South Vietnam collapses faster than expected. Kennedy reverses withdrawal and escalates. We get the Vietnam War anyway, just under Kennedy instead of Johnson. Which scenario is most likely? Nobody knows. Kennedy's dead. We can't ask him. But here's what we can say with confidence. Kennedy's instincts were different from Johnson's. Kennedy had repeatedly chosen de-escalation over escalation. Bay of Pigs taught him not to trust military advisors. Cuban Missile Crisis taught him that generals wanted war when diplomacy would work. Would Kennedy have sent 500,000 troops to Vietnam? Would he have bombed North Vietnam into rubble? Would he have committed to a war that he privately told friends was unwinnable? Maybe. Politicians break promises, circumstances change, events spiral out of control. But Kennedy had demonstrated a pattern: skepticism of military advice, preference for diplomacy, willingness to resist pressure for escalation. Johnson demonstrated the opposite pattern: trust in advisors, belief in military force, willingness to escalate to avoid appearing weak. The outcomes speak for themselves. October 11, 1963, John F. Kennedy signs NSAM 263. Policy is set. Withdraw from Vietnam. November 22, 1963. John F. Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas. November 26, 1963. Lyndon B. Johnson signs NSAM 273. Policy reverses. Escalate in Vietnam. Those are the facts. Everything else is interpretation, speculation, and counterfactual history. But one thing is not speculation: the timing. Kennedy's withdrawal order, October 11, 1963. Kennedy's assassination, November 22, 1963, 42 days. In those 42 days, Kennedy was still president. NSAM 263 was official policy. The withdrawal was beginning. America was on a path out of Vietnam. And then everything changed, not because of military developments, not because of changes in South Vietnam, not because new intelligence revealed the withdrawal was impossible. Everything changed because Kennedy died, and Johnson had different instincts, different advisors, different politics. One bullet in Dallas, and 10 years later, 58,000 Americans dead, millions of Vietnamese dead, a nation torn apart by protests, riots, political violence, a war that destroyed Lyndon Johnson's presidency and poisoned American politics for a generation, All because of what happened in those 42 days. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented history. We have the tapes. We have the memos. We have NSAM 263 and NSAM 273. We can compare Kennedy's policy to Johnson's policy and see the reversal. The question isn't whether Kennedy planned to withdraw. He did. The question is whether he would have followed through, and that question will haunt American history forever. Because we'll never know what Kennedy would have done if he'd lived. We only know what Johnson did after Kennedy died, and what Johnson did led to the longest war in American history. A war that Kennedy had planned to end before it began. If this story made you rethink one of history's greatest what-if questions, do something that ensures others discover this hidden chapter. Hit that like button. Every like helps YouTube share this investigation with people who need to understand how one assassination changed the course of a war. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next deep dive into the pivotal moments that shaped our world. Every day we uncover stories buried in declassified documents and secret recordings, tales of plans made and plans destroyed, of alternate histories that never happened, and of the single moments that changed everything. Real documents, real decisions, real consequences. And now, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the US, Vietnam, somewhere else affected by this war? Our community spans the globe, and your voice matters. What do you think? Would Kennedy have withdrawn from Vietnam if he'd lived, or would political pressure have forced him to escalate anyway? Share your thoughts. Let us know you're here, grappling with history's most haunting question. Thank you for watching, and thank you for understanding that history isn't just about what happened. It's about what might have happened, about the plans that were made and the plans that died. Because on October 11, 1963, John F. Kennedy ordered America out of Vietnam. 42 days later, he was dead, and the order died with him. The Vietnam War wasn't inevitable. It was a choice. And for 42 days in 1963, America had chosen differently. Then everything changed.